Let me begin first by asking, Gail, what is a brain difference? What does that mean?
It's not a clinical term. I kind of coined this term because, well, first of all, because when you're talking about mental health issues, mental illnesses, learning disabilities, to be honest, they are so laden with kind of a stigmatized rap that it's difficult to talk about them in a positive way at all, to some degree without people becoming upset. But really, the reason I chose the words brain differences because we all, to some degree, have differently wired brains. There's a project that's wrapping up shortly called the Connectome Project that was funded by the Brain Initiative of the Obama administration. And they are scanning 12,000 brains of, quote, normal people. And the reason they're doing this is we really don't yet even have a roadmap of the brain. And it's really hard to look at problems or pathology when you haven't looked at a large number of normal organs, so to speak. But what they're already finding, and what is already been known to some degree, is that we're all wired a little differently. Male and female brains have tremendous difference between them, but individuals have a lot of difference between them. And really, when we talk about mental illness or a learning disability, what we're often talking about is wiring which is different enough that it causes symptoms that interfere with functioning, and that's really what I'm referring to.
If you gentlemen want to jump in anytime.
Well, the interesting thing about autism is that it's not a brain difference that people can pinpoint yet. So autism is diagnosed by really subjective clinical observation. There's no biomarker for it.
There's no brain scan or anything like that?
Not yet. I mean, there are some signs that...
There's no specific brain scan. There is actually some evidence that, for instance, certain areas, certain regions of the brain become larger. There's more gray matter or more white matter at certain times, but we really can't pinpoint it, which is why it remains a clinical diagnosis.
Well, right.
I mean, given the spectrum, there are more and less severe versions of autism. And
even on the same day in the same person.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And there's something called the right temporal parietal junction, so I apologize for... Sure, I'm sorry. There's something called the right temporal parietal junction, so I apologize for vaguely gesturing at my head, and hopefully that's okay. But this part of the brain seems to be involved in tasks that invoke so-called theory of mind. So to the extent that for some individuals with autism, they have difficulty understanding the intentions of others, that they are in fact not living in simply a perceptual world, but a world full of other beings that have hidden intentions. To the extent that there's a kind of deficit in that part of the brain, there's some evidence, but...
Well, the thing is that the so-called deficits that are associated with autism have changed so many times over the years. Too much gray matter, too little gray matter. So it's really, for me anyway, it's a way of being in the world. And autistic people, as an autistic person once said to me, are more different from one another than neurotypical people are different from one another. In other words, there are autistic people who can't speak, but who can use keyboards to communicate and communicate beautifully. There are other autistic people who are incredibly articulate with spoken language. And so it's a cluster, but it's sort of a cluster of behaviors and traits rather than, at this point, a specific biomarker.
Because in your book, Gail, you mentioned autistic people having tremendous gifts. Talk
the
about
potential for that. So certainly the unifying factor symptomatically is this difficulty in socially relating, difficulty in reading social cues of others. We don't know, again, specifically what the wiring is that causes that impairment all the time, but clearly there is a large group of people with autism that have potentially either great verbal ability, really unusual verbal skills. We used to refer to sometimes some of those people as having Asperger's, or we thought of them as sort of little adults because they would be so articulate, have such enormous verbal capacity, but look very young and otherwise have difficulty socially relating. And some people with autism have remarkable math abilities, memory abilities. People have probably seen, Rain Man, and they think of, somebody who can count unusually or have musical capacity. And so we're not clear why, but certainly something about the difference that causes the autism symptoms also seems to potentially have an etiology in terms of these other kinds of differences that can be really off the charts. Of course, there are people with autism who are called autistic but have very low IQ or have other kinds of struggles that make it very difficult to even manifest something that is an incredible strength potentially. But there are these really, really talented and unusual other effects from being in the autism category.
And I do want to make one point, which is that when we talk about so-called deficits or impairments with autistic people, they can work in both directions in that, yes, many autistic people I know have problem with what you might call perspective taking the perspective of another person. But to say in some sort of absolute sense that, autistic people can't read body language, what I've noticed in hanging out in groups of autistic people is that they can read each other's body language. And neurotypicals, people who are not autistic, often have trouble reading autistic body language. So it's almost like a cultural difference in a way. It's not an absolute deficit that exists, only in the individual.
Because we're seeing more films, television shows that are increasingly dealing with autistic people. And I'm thinking right now about The Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon Cooper is in the spectrum. And in one episode, they actually gave him an invention where he can read the body language of someone else.
Oh, yeah.
Is this a positive thing, to bring this up and under these circumstances, or does it belittle it?
In pop culture?
Yeah.
Well, the problem is that the problem with autistic people in pop culture is that someone will see an autistic character and think, oh, all autistic people are like that. And that was certainly true of Rain Man. And then it became true of Temple Grandin, who was a real autistic adult woman, the first autistic adult to ever come out in public, actually. And so, then when Temple would say, I think in pictures, then everybody would say, oh, autistic people think in pictures. But she figured out later that she was just talking about herself. Yeah.
I just want to piggyback on the concept of brain differences. I think there's a danger that some will think of it negatively. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that especially in the lay world, but also as it happens with psychology undergraduates who are often the participants in a great many studies, the mind is identified with the brain and the self is identified with the brain. And there's a kind of reductionism that's quite disastrous. And so if you were to, for example, advocate that there are brain differences in certain individuals, then people come to identify themselves with those brain differences as opposed to more properly regarding the brain as participating in a much larger physical causal network. So there's a fallacy that often appears in writing and in reporting, and it's really quite unfortunate. Sometimes it's just sloppy writing, but it's something called a mereological fallacy. And mereology is the study of parts and wholes and how they relate to one another. And the idea is, if you take something like a clock, if you were to look at a part of a clock, like a particular gear, it has a particular shape, it's made out of something, it has a particular color, but the properties of that part don't necessarily scale up to the properties of the whole. And likewise, the face of a clock provides information to anyone who's capable of reading it and telling time, but importantly, that gear doesn't have the time. And often what happens is people use language that suggests that the brain thinks, the brain decides, the brain feels, the brain concludes, the brain creates. And I think once we understand that really that's an error of applying predicates that ought to go to a part and applying it ultimately to the whole. I think we can escape, a potential concern for the idea of brain differences, because I support that idea. It's important to understand how initial brain differences participate in something larger, so that we understand the whole person, and
Yes.
they're not just the brain differences. There's more.
They're the whole person. To go back to your point about the Big Bang Theory, I will counter and say that while I can see the problem of thinking that everyone is one character, I, for one, have actually been totally delighted by this show because I think it's 2017 and we still stigmatize all kinds of mental illnesses and all kinds of learning differences. And it unfortunately causes people to delay in seeking treatment or not even recognize that they have a set of symptoms and they need treatment. It prevents, it makes people feel ashamed and then they don't come in. It prevents us from getting research dollars and healthcare dollars because it's sort of this second-rate kind of problem. And when in reality, depression is the #1 source of disability in this country. We lose millions and millions of dollars in productivity, and it affects physical health as well. So it's a huge, huge issue. And I think that until we start to some degree normalizing, or at least acknowledging how many people in this country, close to 50% of Americans, will have a mental health diagnosis at some time in their life. And I think that by having characters like the Sheldons that are in our world and being successful, terribly bright, he has friends, he has a girlfriend, kind of.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't saying it's a bad idea to have autistic characters. It's more like there should be more different kinds of autistic characters. Like, imagine if there was an autistic person of color who was, happening on a very popular, or we should have more female autistic characters, because women are not only underrepresented in research, they're not sort of part of the clinical stereotype of autism, which makes it hard for women to get a diagnosis.
Yeah, that's true.
But autism is just one of the kinds of characterizations we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
We have dyslexia, or you mentioned depression. Let's go to dyslexia for a second, because I was surprised in your book that you diagnosed that Albert Einstein was dyslexic.
Oh, not dyslexic. Attention deficit disorder.
Attention
deficit disorder.
deficit
And by the way, I'll just say, of course, I cannot really diagnose a person who is dead who I've never met. That is definitely, the APA would have a big no-no on that.
It's changing, I think. We'll go on to another subject.
Exactly. But if you do look historically at his letters and letters from others about, and school records, you will see that while he was clearly always brilliant and had aptitude in physics and math, in other subjects, not so much. That there were areas where he, for lack of interest, didn't seem to invest, concentrate. Teachers were annoyed. He was thrown out of school at one point. A teacher told him he would never amount to anything. He had very impulsive things happen in relationships, had a lot of difficulty maintaining those contacts, a lot of impulsive behavior, hit his sister, threw a chair at this one. Things that really sound like boys who end up getting diagnosed with attention deficit or even with hyperactivity. And it fits as in ADD, you have difficulty maintaining your, it's a faulty switch in what's called the default network, the ability to decide when you're attending to something. And so if you're interested in it, though, you might attend so much you hyperfocus, you focus.
And that was that's the positive
and
side.
that's the positive side. So Einstein came up with his amazing theories in a matter of really weeks to months. He wrote these papers in an incredibly short amount of time. While working in the patent office, he was able to focus in and do that in such a short amount of time that it is something that is seen in people with attention deficit disorder.
Let me advocate for posthumous diagnosis.
Okay.
Because as a cognitive psychologist, you don't have, who is interested in creativity, for example, you don't have eminent scientists and visual artists or writers just happen upon your lab. So it's freshmen, sophomore, college students, and if you have some funding, perhaps some people from the neighborhood. So posthumous diagnosis allows you to at least explore some possibilities. So there was a psychiatrist who posthumously diagnosed Emily Dickinson with certain hypomanic episodes throughout her life. And this was on the basis of letters that she had written and certain biographies. And so given that, and given that we know from the letters when she wrote certain poems, you could actually test whether or not there's a relation empirically between hypomanic episodes and the quality of particular poems. And what we were able to do, and again, the assumption, of course, is that the posthumous diagnosis is valid to entertain in the first place. So if you sort of cut that off, then the rest of the data don't matter. But if you grant that diagnosis, what we found was, in fact, during the years in which he suggested that she was hypomanic, she was writing poems that had a greater likelihood of appearing in anthologized editions of poetry. It also happens to be the case that she was writing more during those years, so there's a confound there. So we did some further analyses, and we were able to show that really, if you looked at the years in which she presumably was not hypomanic, and just, I suppose she was fine. There was no evidence to the contrary. She was writing much less. But the more she happened to write, the greater the likelihood, the more she wrote in a particular year, the greater the likelihood that any one of them would appear as a quality poem in some edition in the future. So it's not ultimately evidence to suggest that, at least with hypomania, that hypomanic states cause creativity, but hypomanic states, among other kinds of activities in one's life, might lead to higher rates of production. And the more you produce, the more errors you make, but the more possibilities you see. And again, that increases the likelihood that some of that is actually going to be worthwhile.
Is that a synonym for bipolar, what you were talking about?
So hypomania is a sort of...
one end of it?
Right, so a sort of a reduced version of a sort of manic episode. So in a manic episode, that's not healthy. But with a hypomanic episode, you might have increased energy. As it happens, creativity is one of the ways you could diagnose it as well. But a certain level of confidence as well. So all of those properties are things that you can exhibit while not actually hypomanic.
So you have to learn how to make best use of that, right?
Absolutely.
And is that possible?
I think that it is. I think that actually there are many people who do have bipolar disorder are aware of these periods of time of hypomania and that they feel extremely creative. They actually are extremely creative. The problem is at the same time they have these grandiose feelings, they may feel even more creative than they actually are being. You know, Emily Dickinson, Ernest Hemingway, there is a real correlation between people in the arts, particularly writers, but in music and visual arts, who have bipolar disorder. And yes, many of them are aware that they can do extraordinary work during these hypomanic periods. Unfortunately, what you can't do is decide, I'm going to just stay hypomanic, because ultimately you either become manic, which means you become psychotic, and that you are not creative during that period, you are very, very ill, and that is not a good thing to do. Or you crash and become depressed, which is also not a good thing to do. But what you can do is be treated, and a certain amount of treatment can make you more what's called euthymic, you know, bring up the depressions, bring down the likelihood of going into mania. You might still have some cycles, and you still seem to have, and this is very important because sometimes people are afraid of getting treatment when they have bipolar disorder because they think it will rob them of their creativity. But in reality, it does not. It allows them to take what is clearly this conferred extra creative ability and utilize it, which they can't do when they're ill. So it's true that you might not have that upper, let's say, 5% of incredible creative thought, but the other 95% that you've been conferred, you can make use of if you're treated. So, so talking with someone who is bipolar about getting treatment, but at the same time being aware of when they're in a state of flow, of high creativity, and being able to harness and make use of those thoughts, write them down.
It's euphoric and self-reinforcing as well. So.
Exactly.
Well, that sounds like behavioral therapy as opposed to medication, or are we talking about both of them?
No, it depends. It depends on the person, but often with bipolar disorder, we are talking about medication. But there are many people in the field who, for example, lithium is a stable, very commonly used medication in bipolar disorder, but it can be used in small doses. Where it is, so people have had the experience of it being used in large doses and they feel very squashed, creatively squashed. But it can be used in small doses where people actually feel that they still have this creative flow, but it keeps them from bottoming out.
Well, that was a question I was asking about all these different brain differences. If you are in a creative mood and you know you're productive, do you want to get medication that's going to take you out of that mood or behavioral therapy? You want to be there.
You do want to be there, and that is what keeps people sometimes from coming in. But what is important to know is that creativity is sort of this flux between having a messy brain and an ordered brain. The messiness, the disinhibition, the flow of ideas, if you're in this hypomanic state or in other states, is where the generation of many ideas come from. And as you were just saying, if you might have some that are lousy, but if you have many, and they're diverse and original, some of them are going to be really good. And you're going to have a higher percentage of good because you just have so many. But you have to then have the ordered part of the brain to take that idea and bring it to fruition. Otherwise, you just have like somebody who's walking around saying, this idea, but isn't able to put it to paper or put it to canvas or actually bring it to fruition.
But just say the balancing act is really quite important. So there's a theory called the match filter hypothesis. And the idea is that a lot of creative states are a balance between frontal activity and more occipital, parietal, and temporal kinds of activity. So if I were to show you, for example, this is work done by Sharon Thompson-Shiel at the University of Pennsylvania, eventually at Chrissaquah at Kansas, so I'm a collaborator of mine. And if you were to show a participant in fMRI scanner, if you were to show them a picture of a baseball and ask them to come up with alternative uses for a baseball, or excuse me, for a baseball bat, a good creative use is something like use it as a rolling pin. Whereas a common use for a baseball bat would be to swing it and to hit a ball and play baseball. And what you find is that when asked to come up with alternative, creative kinds of uses, you have a kind of trade-off between frontal areas and more posterior areas, such that occipital temporal cortex, that's actually going to be more active for sort of creative ideas, because in a sense you're breaking away from certain tradition, whereas the frontal activity is ultimately going to be a bit more rule-based, and you see that correlated with tasks that simply involve, here's a baseball bat, what do you do with it? You use it as a baseball bat. And you can actually experimentally induce creative states with transcranial direct current stimulation, which it's basically applying a small jolt of electricity to your brain. And what you find is if you were to inhibit frontal areas and thereby presumably releasing activity that's more posterior, they end up being faster at giving creative responses to the baseball bat example.
And isn't it also true that using transcranial magnetic stimulation, people can produce drawings that are actually more accurate to the external scene? With more bottom-up detail, you might say?
Depending on the kind of stimulation and where. So,
right.
With transcranial magnetic stimulation...
what is that?
You're ultimately using a magnet.
You use a magnet and put it on somebody's brain?
Right, and you're essentially taking advantage of the magnetic properties of iron in your brain. What I was referring to is actually transcranial direct current stimulation, which is just as safe and non-invasive, but doesn't, in most places, require a neurologist on site. Yeah.
You remind me of a story when I was in college and I was studying psychology, and I had a professor who worked in the primate lab, and he was involved in deciding whether monkeys, how intelligent they were, and he was going to give them the tool problem, and he said, I'm going to give a monkey a baseball bat and a banana up there and see if he takes the bat and can hit the banana with it. And he's watched the monkey, and the monkey didn't do that, and just as he was about to give up, he saw the monkey put the bat down and balanced himself on the end of the bat and grabbed a banana. Yeah. So you never know where creativity is. Let's move on to something that we, certainly in the age that we're living in, is I think everybody is aware of, and that is stress. Dealing with stress as a problem. You write about stress in your book. Do we have different modes that people use, more successful? How do people now, are there people who have a much more difficult time dealing with stress than other people do?
Well, certainly autistic people can feel stressed out in an environment that isn't suited to them, really, so that they can be stressed out by something like the buzzing of a fluorescent light that a non-autistic person wouldn't even be aware of, or the subliminal flicker of a fluorescent light, say. So you can reduce stress by changing the environment. Obviously there are also medications that reduce anxiety, but one of the promising areas for people with autism is designing environments that stress them out less, basically. And it's a way of thinking about disability that goes beyond wheelchair ramps and curb cuts. It's thinking about cognitive disabilities that also require accommodation, just the way we accommodate physical disabilities.
So I think when I'm thinking about stress, and I mean, life is full of stress. My husband's out there. Life is stressful no matter what, right? And it will grow to fill the space, whatever your space is. But when there's a high stress in the environment, particularly high stress, it can make any of these problems worse, obviously. But really, when I think about stress, I'm talking about anxiety disorders often.
Okay.
And everybody has anxiety, and that's a normal warning sign that there's something going on in the environment. But when your warning signal is on overdrive, and so everything seems like there might be a bear outside the cave, then
that's how it's been in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
Good example.
Good example. Then you might have a system that is genetically or biologically predisposed to anxiety. Anxiety does have a genetic component, does run in families. And we're not talking about just, I get nervous from time to time, or I worry about things from time to time, but somebody who's worrying all day about many things, generalized anxiety, or has panic attack symptoms. So yes, I think, there are many stressful things in the environment right now which are making a lot of people worry,
right.
But it's the people who are probably predisposed to high anxiety because they have this high alert system that are really struggling the most in some ways. And anxiety is one of the few that I talk about where maybe there isn't as clear-cut a wiring upside as some of the others. Certainly, as an anxious person myself, I can say one may be, as a result of anxiety, very driven, very leave no stone unturned, very vigilant, very vigilant with work, and very emotionally vigilant. Anxious people tend to read other people, their emotional expressions very well. That can really pay off. It's actually interesting that anxiety actually in some ways has co-evolved with intelligence. A lot of people that are highly anxious, neurotic, you New Yorkers know what I'm talking about, are very bright. So there are some conferred differences, I think, that do still have an upside, but there's no question but that if you are highly stressed and it is making your anxiety erupt to the point where you are struggling with an anxiety disorder, while there might be an optimum performance level, you've all heard of performance anxiety, athletes who do best, or students who do best when they have enough anxiety, it makes them perform better on a test. But too much anxiety and you trip over the other side and you don't do well on anything, and that's when you should think about treatment.
What kind of treatment?
Well, there are multiple modalities that are actually really great for anxiety disorders. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is Short-lived is about looking at your cognitions, your thoughts, and how to and being aware of what they are and how they are feeding your anxiety and how to change them.
That'd be something like mindfulness?
Mindfulness is not a CBT modality, but it has been shown to be very useful overall for anxiety, and is sort of a form of meditation that seems to calm the brain, if you will. Psychodynamic psychotherapy have some studies to show that it is also useful for anxiety. There are many variants, actually, of cognitive behavioral therapy that have been shown to be useful, but also medications, of course, can be very, very useful, and in conjunction with psychotherapy, but even things like exercise, which is something that everybody can incorporate. I'm talking about like 30 minutes of like vigorous aerobic exercise multiple times a week has been shown to decrease anxiety and improve
How about
mood.
yoga? Is yoga?
I think yoga that is more about mindfulness and meditation, perhaps. I don't know yoga per se. I haven't seen studies about just yoga.
Do we know if this is my favorite topic, so I have to bring it up. Do we know anything about the connection between our microbiome and the brain? I know from the research I keep reading about, the microbiome is all these trillions of bacteria and viruses that live in us. They digest our food, but they also get hungry, want to eat, and they're all there, and they're being linked to possibly other disorders, and one of them is depression, because there is a nerve connection that goes up to your brain. Is this an area people are studying?
It's a thing.
It's a thing. Is it more than a thing?
It's
No,
the
it
hot
is-
topic.
it is
It's the
more
hot
than a thing.
topic now.
I had coffee last week, actually, with someone who's working on the microbiome, and she told me that within 10 years there'll be targeted therapeutics. And she was the opposite of somebody who was hyping her own work, but she thinks that we're closer than we are farther from having targeted therapeutics to, literally using specific organisms to change our mood.
Right.
Yeah.
So far, no one has shown that taking probiotics.
No.
Right.
Part of the reason
Well,
is because we
yeah.
don't know which organisms are producing chemicals or producing inflammation,
Right.
body inflammation. I mean, the question of nerves, but I think the bigger question has to do with overall inflammation
Right.
in the body, and if, reaching through the blood-brain barrier and affecting neurotransmitters, et cetera, in the brain. And we don't know which bacteria are going to be the good bacteria and work, and which will not.
And the ones that are most effective will probably be very specific, she said.
Yeah.
So it's not just like eat your yogurt.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's not bad to eat.
Right. No, it's good. But
Which brings me, I'm going to see how much time before we're going to take questions, about 10 minutes. Before then, I'm going to ask you what I ask a lot of people on Science Friday, researchers, is the blank check question, which is if you had a blank check and could spend it on any area of research. Let me go on this end, start down. What would you do with it? What do you want to know that you don't know? And what tools would you like to have? What makes, you can be, sky high and come up with a tool you will need that doesn't exist. So, because you have a blank check, you can make it.
Sure. I'm hesitant about inventing the technology of the future, but tabling that just for the moment, I think that the most important and underfunded topic that we could pursue as a society, but myself as a cognitive scientist, is ultimately the arts. And now I'm specifically interested in language and linguistic creativity, but the visual arts are fine as well. Some of my work is interested in the relation between the amount of print exposure you have. So as a proxy to how much you've read, because I'm not going to get a list of all the books that you've read, you're not going to remember, I can't verify it. If I were to show you a list of authors and ask you to identify which one are authors and which one are fake names, that particular index ends up being a very good predictor of measures of empathy, both behavioral measures of empathy, but also other questionnaires. And what's interesting about the world of psychology of fiction is that there aren't many of us, but the consequences of what we could find seem to me to be profound. That the going idea is that the more you read, the more you are exposed to different ideas, different perspectives. And there have been studies now in my lab, but certainly others before me, that suggest literary fiction as opposed to nonfiction. So nonfiction is great, but nonfiction is not necessarily going to be related to empathy. In my lab, we actually find science fiction and fantasy to be related to empathy. And the idea for me as a science fiction fan is that the best science fiction is essentially morality. They're morality plays. And it's an alien with some ridges on their forehead or their nose, whatever the budget allows. But ultimately, it's about understanding people that are different than you. And to the extent that funding is certainly not very much and presumably to be cut, I think I would back the truck up and put the money there.
The arts is always a good way to get to people, to talk to them.
I hope it doesn't sound like a safe answer. I genuinely
I'm a great believer. You know, there's a whole thing called STEAM instead of STEM.
Yeah.
STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You take an A for the arts, you stick it in there, and you get STEAM, which is very, we're recognizing that's a way to reach people. What would you do?
I'm going to give a relatively humble answer, but it's still ambitious. Do you know that there has never been a national survey of the number of autistic adults who are out there in America? We don't know how many autistic adults are out there in America, despite the fact that we've spent the past 15 or 20 years arguing over an alleged autism tsunami. Now, my book goes into the historical forces that conspired to create that idea, but a couple of years ago, a guy at the University of Edinburgh did such a survey there and found that there were just as many autistic adults as there were autistic kids. And so that would suggest, and he suggested in the study, that there was no tsunami. So we don't even know how many autistic adults are out there. We have done so little research towards improving the quality of life for autistic adults because we've spent billions and billions of dollars obsessing about what causes autism. And it could be that we're about to plunge into another historical period where the focus of federal efforts is is it vaccines, because that's the obsession. One of the great ideas that Hillary Clinton had was doing a national survey to find the autistic adults who were out there. And she came up with that idea in part by talking to autistic adults.
You think there's any possibility of that kind of survey?
I have no idea what's going to happen under this administration.
Is there any?
But it's a very good idea.
Well, but is there any private organization or public?
Well, it would be a very, very large project,
How many do you think go uncounted?
Well, okay. The current CDC estimate of the prevalence of autism among school children is 1 in 68. So if the same is true here as is true in England, then 1 in 68 adults are autistic as well. But we don't know that yet. And all the fundraising efforts and everything, you always see pictures of children. They're cute, but the adults are unacknowledged and trying to get by, often without even a diagnosis. And I once asked a middle-aged autistic woman what it was like to be diagnosed in midlife. And she said, for me, getting a diagnosis was like finding the Rosetta Stone to myself.
Because she finally understood what the problem was.
Yes, exactly. And it was, she had been blaming herself her whole life for her social.
Could this be true of all the other things we're talking about? Surveys of, people. Gail, what would you do with your?
The numbers are a little more accurate for depression, who has depression, but it really looms large, and we really don't understand the etiology well at all. 1 out of 10 people in their lifetime will have depression. It carries a 15% mortality rate from suicide. It's one of the top causes of death in adolescence, suicide. And I would love to see obviously a better understanding in that area in addition to other areas. But really, if I had the money, I would put the money, I'm a clinician, and I would, of people who present with a mental health diagnosis in the country, 12% of those people see a psychiatrist. That's it, 12%.
It's because there's stigma, or is it they don't get it covered?
It's a combination of stigma, not enough practitioners. I mean, we're in New York. You can't walk down the sidewalk without bumping into a psychiatrist, but that is very unusual. And in many parts of the country, there is one psychiatrist per hundreds of thousands of people. So there are, and particularly in child psychiatry, I mean, there is a scarcity, and many of the practitioners are now 60 and above. We are bringing fewer and fewer people into the field to replace those who will retire. So it's really a problem that many people do not get treatment who need treatment. And as I said, with the disability being what it is and the dollars lost, we just really we have mental health parity in this country, but we don't have mental health parity. People cannot afford treatment, they don't have practitioners, or they are stigmatized out of seeking treatment.
Okay, some more stuff to talk about. Let's go to the audience. No phone calls. Question number 1. How often are people misdiagnosed with a mental illness? It's going back to, let's start with depression. When do people know that they have a mental illness, and how? If you're saying there are not enough psychiatrists to diagnose them.
Well, it is a dilemma in the sense that, as Steve said, these are clinical diagnoses, and so there is an art and a science to diagnosis. And you are sitting with a patient. You are asking them a history, you are asking them their family history, you are asking them about symptoms, you are watching over a trajectory of time, and sometimes that's not so accurate. In addition, we made these neat boxes. I talk about these symptoms. Do you have anxiety? Do you have depression? And so on. And the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatrists that we use to make diagnoses, that's sort of like the best language we have. Those are the best boxes we could kind of come up with at this point. But they're artificial boxes. Right. And they're not, it's going to turn out to probably be that many things are depression and many things are in the schizophreniform realm. And we don't yet look at symptoms, and we don't have neurological brain identifiers for them. So necessarily there are misdiagnoses, and we need better eliciting of what each of these symptoms are and their correlates in the brain to do better.
We talked about stress and anxiety before. Can extreme anxiety bring on the symptoms of one of these other illnesses? You don't know you have, and then suddenly the anxiety brings on, and you go to the doctor and find out, or you find out some other way. What do you think?
What do I think? Well, mostly what I know about autism is autism. That's why I'm here. And for many people, chronic anxiety is a primary feature of their autism. And one of the things I wanted to mention in relation to misdiagnosis is that autistic women are often misdiagnosed because what autism looks like to clinicians is so keyed to male traits and behaviors. And so many of the women who I speak to, autistic adults, have been diagnosed with multiple things, depression, anxiety, because the clinicians simply don't know what autism looks like in women. And so I don't know if I answered your question about anxiety.
But isn't ADD the same way? It shows up differently
Yeah, absolutely.
than it does in men?
And stress does make all of these things potentially appear worse. Definitely trauma or high stress in the environment makes any one of these things potentially worse, or at stressful times, that may be the moment when a diagnosis first presents. So, bipolar disorder often presents in late teens, early 20s. There may be a very stressful time in life going on. That it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have presented with that if you didn't have the stress, but it just may be the time when you see that happen.
Another question. How can helping professionals be trained to be most effective when there is such a diversity of issues from person to person?
Try to be aware of that, I would say, that to attend to the individual and the individual circumstance.
I would like to say that most good clinicians and researchers, I think, are aware that there is such individuality, and that's really what, that unlike a cardiologist where, this is what your heart is supposed to look like if it's a normal heart, and if it's not looking like that, then we say, you have this or you have this. the mind is so complex, and we don't yet, I mean, this is what you were speaking to.
Yeah, just in general, you have something like the DSM, which is based on qualities or kinds or categories, and then a label that gets attached to it, and that label gets to go on an insurance form. So it's very convenient to box people in as you either have something or you don't have something that's recognized by some board. But I think in terms of being more inclusive, recognizing that you, in fact, have a spectrum, that you have some kind of neurodiversity, that there are better and worse examples, or statistically more typical examples of a particular set of symptoms. So recognizing that diversity is, I think, part of it.
In fact, to some degree, these diagnoses are really extremes of things that we all experience that are completely normal, but they've risen to the level where they are causing you suffering and they are interfering with your functioning. That's essentially the definition of any of these diagnoses. So in that sense, I'm saying we are all individuals. We all experience sadness, anxiety. Sometimes we can't concentrate. Sometimes we have difficulty relating to others. Some of us have more of one than the other. But at the same time, the point I'm trying to make in the book is, along with these things are conferred individual strengths that are sometimes unique. In the case of, say, dyslexia, it may be you have incredible visual spatial abilities, you have incredible pattern recognition. And so when we look at these individual diagnoses and individual differences and difficulties, we have to recognize that they also come with these wired-in abilities.
Did I read that you have incredible empathy? People with dyslexia have great empathy for other people.
Yes.
Why is that?
Some of the answer would have to be we don't know, because we don't know from a wiring perspective whether part of what causes difficulty in decoding or processing in the left hemisphere is also has something to do with the connectivity of deeper emotional structures or social mirroring structures that make us more empathic, and how much might be the experience of having really struggled and really suffered with something as a very young person, and being able to utilize that experience to understand suffering in others in a certain kind of way. People with depression describe the same thing.
And just quickly, I think one important change that we could make in the education system would be when individualized education plans are drawn up for kids who have been identified as having learning differences, that the strengths as well as the challenges are listed on the IEP. So the strengths can be cultivated and built on, which then can become a pathway into a viable future.
Absolutely.
Do we pick up these brain differences early enough with kids? Are they
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, kids with IEPs. Yes, we picked up a brain difference, but I think the problem is that the way that we think about them is that we only think in terms of what they can't do or struggle to do, and don't think in terms of what do they love doing, what skills could be developed that are there in nascent form.
And the brains of children are quite different, even for fMRI. Even if you could get them to sit still, lie still in the scanner, it's still the case that you look at a 5, 6, 7-year-old, they into the 20s, quite frankly, but they exhibit hypofrontality, and so there's a relative lack of activity in the front, which allows them a certain freedom away from convention. So you have them quite thinking outside of the box. So there's a sense in which even if you were to test them, they're not going to be able to, you can't hold them to the same standards as adults because the brains are just going to be so different.
You mentioned Einstein before, and he was known to be a big daydreamer, and you said that was a positive thing about what he had.
Absolutely, and actually he talked about that. If you want your children to be brilliant like me, he said you should let them spend time using their imagination, read them fairy tales. He knew that about himself. We do actually sometimes wait too long to recognize that there is a symptom in a child. I think part of the reason for that, again, is it's such a crushing idea to a parent, for example, that might be hard for them to even recognize that there's a symptom going on that might need an evaluation. And it's also sometimes difficult to recognize what's just they're being a kid, and we all have, our kids are all different. And when does it rise to the level of, no, there's actually an issue going on? The only reason that's unfortunate sometimes is that because a child's mind is so plastic, the brain is so plastic in youth, but I mean, it stays plastic all through life, meaning you keep making new neurons and new connections potentially, but most so when you're young. The earlier the treatment, the quicker essentially it can work, as it were, and set the kid back on this developmental path, which spares them a lot of suffering along the way. So, but I know parents are reticent to do that. They're worried about their child being labeled. They're worried about them carrying that label going forward. And if we could see that there are strengths that come along with these things, and that was part of the plan, I think that everybody, educators, parents, would feel less concerned that this is, as if they're giving them a terrible label, but that they're
exactly.
but that they are saying this is,
Recognizing
they have this package, right,
exactly.
and it has this strength, and what in the school, or what am I as a parent going to help my child to do to play to those strengths?
You're either good, you may be a better writer, a musician, a mathematician.
And don't I want to give you those opportunities in whatever your free time is, and in school, don't I want to talk to the teacher and say, what project can my child do to show what they know, but that uses the prism of their wheelhouse, of what they're really good at, because that's going to help them shine and feel good about themselves, and P.S., you will get to see that you taught them something and they learned it.
There's a wonderful movie out now called Life, Animated by Ron Suskind, and his son was obsessed with all things Disney, completely obsessed. Like many autistic kids, he lost speech at a certain age. And they thought that they were facing this terrible future where Owen would never speak, they could never relate to him. And one night, Ron, Owen's father, had this sort of light bulb go over his head to address Owen in the voice of a character from one of Owen's favorite Disney movies. And Owen eventually started talking again, and they used his passion for Disney to work with him. And he eventually was able to really become independent, which is something that looked very implausible when he was very young.
Well, what you're saying is, what you talk about in your book too, is that you can become independent if you learn how to do some of the workarounds that you need to do, right?
Yes.
Everybody finds a workaround.
And also how to ask for what you need and stand up for, advocate for yourself.
But in each of these kinds of issues, having coping skills, I mean,
Yeah.
or yes, workarounds. I mean, if it's dyslexia, you might be talking about other ways of processing, reading information, and utilizing your other skills, or maybe it is, you know, whenever you can see graphs or pictures or some other way of absorbing the information, you opt for that. But those are important things that parents can help kids acquire. Treaters can help kids acquire, but educators can also help kids acquire.
I think with parents and clinicians, I think we also have to, as a society, escape the stigma of certain kinds of labels. So schizophrenia is certainly maladaptive. I happen to have a book on poetry written by people with schizophrenia, but that's not terribly common. It can be debilitating. But you do have variability, so you can have individuals that score high on schizotypy, so so-called schizotypes, and they are recognized in terms of disordered perceptions in terms of how they think about the world and how they look at others. And what you find is a positive about these people, despite perhaps being labeled, they happen to find their way into creative professions, especially visual professions, and they score higher on certain measures of creativity in the lab. So the label itself might be scary, but if we recognize that actually it's embracing a kind of diversity of how we process the world and how we are different creatures, that's
And
great.
there have been some studies of dyslexia where, it's kind of almost well known now that a lot of CEOs are dyslexic, and it could be because they figured out how to delegate very effectively the things that they can't do themselves.
I know that with ADD people. I know ADD
Yes.
people who delegate everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
And their homes are covered with Post-it notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a workaround.
That's a workaround because they're gonna forget it, so they put a
Right,
quick
right.
Post-it
Right.
note up as soon. But
they're CEOs because they have a higher incidence of original, innovative, outside of the box thoughts, which have to do with really their disease, if you want to put it that way. And I'm so glad you brought up schizophrenia, because of course that's probably the most dreaded.
Right.
People get, but the data really show this higher incidence of divergent thinking, creative, out-of-the-box thinking for people who have that kind of thought process.
Are there employers who recognize this in their employees and creatively can match them up with someone who can be their other half of stuff that there's?
Well, that would be my wish.
But that doesn't.
I would say that's unusual.
Yeah.
There probably are some very enlightened employers, but that's the workaround for the employer, essentially. I mean, or for yourself, if you have ADD, you might know that you're a very original thinker and have all these plans, but that implementing them is not your strong suit. And whether we're talking about pairing kids in school who, for group projects with, one who's like the idea kid and one who's like the meticulous, like really get it done, steps 1 through 5, kid together. But in the business world, yes, that would be ideal.
There's actually a rapidly growing field of employers who are seeking autistic employees, actually. But what you have to do is to change the interview process. Because if you think about it, the classic interview instructions are firm handshake, make eye contact, really sell yourself. These are all things that are very, very difficult for autistic people to do. So I just, in fact, had lunch the other day with a guy in Canada with an organization called Ready, Willing, and Able that is a government-funded organization that matches autistic people up with employers and tells them how to rework their interview process so that it's appropriate, so the person can demonstrate their skills.
We have a lot of robotic interviews now.
Right.
So it's not going to, you're not going to shake hands.
No, but there are going to be adults with autism who are going to be so much better at certain technical, repetitive jobs, coding, certain kinds of jobs where they're going to have the aptitude and the enjoyment in sitting and, we call the symptom perseveration. That's not a good thing, that you keep doing the same thing over and over again and you can't break away. But if you perseverate in your job, in something that is maybe to somebody else tedious and constantly repeating, you could be excellent in that job.
Let me just say, the biggest employer that is doing this now is a multinational software company called SAP. And originally they were just going to hire autistic people to be software debuggers, because many autistic people have good pattern recognition and quickly detect flaws. What they found was that these employees were so competent that they became project managers and filled positions that they never thought autistic people could fill, that were not strictly repetitive or just about code debugging or whatever, that actually as they were able to get into solid employment, their skills developed rapidly.
So when they do an interview with an employee, they look for the autistic traits of somebody, so they want to hire that person? How do they?
Well, I mean, this is a special program.
Oh, it's a special program.
Like at SAP, it's called Autism at Work.
I see. Do we have any statistics on whether people with different, whether it's autism or whatever, seek out partners or mates who are their complement or not?
Well, what SAP does is they build a circle of support around the employee. And so they get to know the employee even before they come into the office, they hang out with them. You'd think, okay, well, God, this is like charity. This must be really expensive. What's true, it turns out, SAP has learned, is that autistic employees are very, very loyal. And while non-autistic employees are constantly angling to get into different companies and climb the ladder, that if an autistic person is in a situation that they can depend on, where they can really apply their intelligence and skills, they stay. And as the director of the Autism at Work program in the US said to me, this is not about charity. This is about making money for our stockholders, because they don't have to keep retraining people for positions.
Well, you have such interesting lunches. I
do. That's all I do.
You, I want all these lunches. Let me go to some more questions. We're running out of time. I want to get some more of these in. Can you talk about alternative treatments to medication? You touched on this a little bit, but obviously a lot of people are very interested in alternatives to medication.
Well, obviously it depends on what kind of problem you're talking about. But there are, medication is cheap.
People are afraid of it. It is
People are afraid of it, but
and I'm going to go on your side and say it's
Yeah.
something that a psychiatrist
Yes.
can throw at somebody.
So,
They have treated them.
Well, insurance companies know that you can spend a very short amount of time with somebody giving them medication, where their primary care physician can give them medication, whereas psychotherapy takes time. And so that's a lot of the battle in terms of what's out there and what's available to people. But certainly there are some disorders where medication really may be necessary. Schizophrenia, for example, often in bipolar disorder, depending on what is going on with the autistic child, it's possible. But there are also, but almost all studies show that if you're even going to use medication, pretty much across the board, using psychotherapy with medication is always more effective. But there are plenty of different kinds of psychotherapy that are very effective. We mentioned cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, interpersonal psychotherapy. I mean, there are a million different kinds of psychotherapy.
Aren't they almost all equally effective?
And so far, it kind of depends on what you're treating.
Right.
And the other problem with the data of what's more effective is that it has been, CBT has been the forefront of doing research, and psychodynamic psychotherapy, not really, because it's harder to quantify. So some therapies show they work, but it's really because we looked at them in a research model as opposed to not. But multiple different kinds of psychotherapy can be effective. I think what's growing right now is the data around mindfulness and meditation and other methods of sort of calming the brain,
which I use
doing
to treat
yourself.
my own anxiety from having written a book.
There you go.
Yeah.
Breathe. Various forms of breathing, yogic breathing, which is not yoga. There are, I know people feel very frightened about the idea of transmagnetic stimulation or electroconvulsive therapy, and they're frightened because they think of movies like, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something, but really, some of these kinds of treatments are shown to be quite effective for people who are refractory to therapy and to medication. And we're talking about people who are really mightily suffering and at risk for suicide sometimes. And the reality is that these treatments, which actually do have few side effects, are actually very effective.
There's a particular subfield in ethics and neuroscience called neuroethics. And one of the main charges is that the more we learn about the brain, the more we may come to reevaluate what it means to be a human being, especially if you were to reduce human thought to just brain processes and chemicals. And I think it's relevant to the question having to do with medication. There's nothing inherently wrong with medication, but if you were to regard yourself as nothing but this physical chemical set of processes in a meat bag, and that's what medication is, it's just more of that. And I think that can be degrading. And so there's a sense in which if you instead regard medication as a necessary component of sort of putting your body in tune and thinking of yourself more holistically, then I think medication can play a part in a successful rehabilitation or whatever treatment, whatever happens to be.
The thing about medication is, the brain is a bunch of neurochemicals. Yeah. That's reality. Emotion is transmitted through chemical, and so the idea that one can alter to some degree something that seems to have gone awry via chemical makes a lot of sense. The problem with medications to a lot of people today, understandably, is that we're sort of shooting a fly with a cannonball. We can't really limit, we can't send only the chemical to this part of your brain or these set of neurons. So once you've altered something, to some degree you're altering many things, which is why you have side effects, and which is why some people are not happy with medication.
Do you think 50 years from now, what will psychologists and psychiatrists look back at this era and say, boy, were they
primitive?
Primitive.
Yeah. That would be, we look back 50 years and we say, oh my gosh, I don't even want to be associated with what went on 50 years ago.
I was going to say, I think one thing that all of us are about up here tonight is that 50 years ago, I think there was this idea that there was the normal brain, and that if you had any of these conditions, you were falling short of this ideal. And now I think we're understanding that there are as many different types of brains as there are organisms in a rainforest. and that the community of humanity is stronger if we have different types of minds working together.
I'm really saying primitive because, the brain is our most complex organ, and we don't understand the organ the way we understand our other organs. And so, but what I think is so exciting is I do think in many ways we're on a precipice of understanding so much more. We have imaging ability that we didn't have that's now being utilized, the ability to look at metabolism in the brain, the ability to look at structure in the brain, the ability to look at certain chemicals, tagging chemicals in the brain, that is going to give us so much more information that I think that we're at a really exciting time.
You mentioned earlier that in terms of functional connectivity, that's really, really exciting, because it's not simply saying that there is one part of the brain that you can localize and say it's especially involved in a particular task, but it depends on the control condition and it depends on the kinds of tasks that you happen to use in your lab. We're actually getting a better sense about the fact of the brain being a series of different networks, and it's really important to understand how they interact and the time course in that.
And 50 years from now, I think we're going to stop thinking about the brain as like floating up in a vat in our skull somewhere, and think of it in terms of interacting with things like the microbiome in our gut.
So we'll still be talking about the old nature-nurture question, which is more influence on our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we now understand that while nature or genetic, you are born with some genetic material, we know that the environment now turns genes on and off, so that this is a constant interplay. So 50 years ago we thought, was it your nature or was it your nurture? And we went through horrible times of telling mothers of children with schizophrenia it was their fault because they were refrigerator mothers, and we went through all this as part of that debate. But we at least do understand now that there is this interplay, and but we don't understand how much of each and how things exactly are turned off and on, and how that ultimately results in symptoms, or more importantly, can we prevent something from being turned off or on, and therefore prevent or alleviate symptoms?
This is all, to me, part of the larger question of consciousness. Can we ever understand? Again, can we look at ourselves, because we're in the box, and understand what consciousness is from outside the box? And you think we'll ever, every 50 years, is it always 30 years away that, I always talk about nuclear fusion. Oh yeah, it's always 30 years away, Is this that kind of question? Is it a useful question to ask? Or is it just too much daydreaming?
What may be necessary is to reconceptualize what consciousness is. So if you take consciousness to be an empirical object that you can observe with your senses, you could spot it, you can see your own self-consciousness and measure it and so forth, I think ultimately that's going to be wrong-headed. And one way of thinking about consciousness, instead of being empirical, is to think of it as transcendental. And the idea would be that consciousness is that in virtue of which there is any empirical objects at all. So I experience the world in the particular way I do because of my consciousness. The consciousness is a set of preconditions that allow me to have experiences whatsoever. So it's not that consciousness is going to be something that I ever find. It's in a sense enabling conditions. And so it could be a bit of a phantom that you're looking for, which is not to say that it's an illusion. It's just not something that you're going to find.
And also, as we look closer at consciousness, we discover that it's not that it's so simple as that there's an external world out there, we create a representation of it in here, and that's consciousness. Actually, consciousness is put together out of a lot of fragmentary information, and there are sort of gaps that are filled in by our brain so that we don't notice that there are gaps in this information. We feel like we're living in a continuous stream of our senses, but I think the closer that we look at consciousness, the more we discover that it's actually discontinuous and sort of granular in interesting ways, but our brain creates what seems like a seamless world out of all this fragmentary information.
I'm actually hoping that we hold on to the concept of our unconscious and how important that is in terms of driving our behavior or driving our feeling states. We move away from that as we continue to move into a more medicalized world, but as a psychoanalyst, in addition to being a psychiatrist, I think it's very clear culturally and societally and on an individual emotional level how much our our collective unconscious is driving, is the driver. And I hope we continue to be aware of how important it is to become aware of those things that are driving us.
Good topic for another discussion, because
Right.
we have run out of time. Thank you, thank you all for
Thank you.
Gail Saltz. Latest book is Power of Difference. Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, and Christopher Ramey, assistant professor of psychology, University of Kansas. You guys are going to be autographing some books out there.
We're going to be around the corner.
Thank you all for.
Thank you so much
We'll see
for
you on
coming.
Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.